I'm Alex Pault, and I'd like to welcome you to another episode of Talking Timepieces, where we talk about watch collecting and horology. Today, we've got the new Seiko 5 GMT, and we're going to take a close-up look at it and determine whether or not it's worth buying. Spoiler alert, it's totally worth buying. It has a couple of quirks that I think are interesting, but all in all, it's a great watch, especially for a GMT. Before we turn the camera around, if you like the show, please like it, and I would hope you subscribe. Tell your friends to subscribe. Tell your friends to like it. All of that stuff helps the algorithm, helps the channel. So let's turn the camera around and take a close look at this watch. Here's the Seiko 5 GMT. I do not know how they normally pack Seiko 5s. I don't currently own one. I can say that this packaging is nicer than the last Seiko I got my hands on. So it's got the outside box. There's the inner box. And there's some paperwork. Okay, very nice. Let's see what we got here. Seiko 5. A little bit of foam. And there is the piece. I took it out earlier. I just figured I would let you all see the full impact. I did resize it already. And in general, this is a really, when you think about how much money you spend on a watch and how much money you can spend on a watch, this watch looks very reasonable, especially considering that it's a GMT, because even though it's what people would call an office GMT, it is a true GMT in that the GMT hand and the local hand can be set independently. In this case, it is the GMT hand which is independently set. And I'll go into that when I do my GMT shootout. I'll explain the differences between the types of GMT watches. But essentially, you've got watches where you can adjust the local hand, a flying local hand, which is good if you're traveling. And the GMT hand stays at your home time. Or you have a GMT hand that's adjustable, a flying GMT hand, like in this case, and the local hand then continues to track the local time. That's why they call this type of watch an office GMT, because it's easier to track a distant time than it is to track where you are, local time, as if you were traveling. But what I do like, there are several things about this watch I like a lot. And there are a couple of things that I'm not thrilled with, but I can live with. The first thing about it is I actually have come to like the bezel. One of the things that I really like about the new piece, I decided, is that the bezel has no spring in it, no detent, no click. They obviously did it so that they could be bidirectional on this bezel without having to put a lot of effort into re-engineering the bezel, because a lot of companies will take just a diving bezel and put the information on it, and it only goes in one direction. So even though it's a GMT bezel, because it's based on a diving bezel that the company didn't want to spend the extra money to re-engineer the bezel or the case to make it bidirectional and have a spring, Seiko said, what the heck? Let's make it a feature, not a bug. We'll remove the spring, and then that way we can go in both directions without any problem. And it is pretty tight. I won't say that it's stiff. It's very fluid. It feels very smooth, but there is no detent at all. And that addresses another issue that a lot of Seikos are prone to, and that is misalignment on the bezel. In fact, even the fancier models do have some alignment issues. I'll go into that when I do the review of this. Hasn't come up yet, but it will. And that one's not misaligned a tremendous amount, but when you're off by a hair and it's a click detent, it can really drive you nuts. Whereas here, there's no detent. So it always lines up, which is nice, as I said. Yes, I do think that that's an interesting quirk of the watch that is worth mentioning. So I said, it's not something I dislike. I actually have come to like it. But when I first encountered it, I thought it was a little odd. The other part that I'm not a fan of is I'm not a big fan of Jubilee style bracelets because it makes the watch look like it's trying to be something it's not. And, well, the fact that this is obviously not a watch that would sport a traditional Jubilee, they can get away with it to a degree. You know, it's obvious that they're not trying to look like a Rolex, but I think they could have come away with a more sporty, chunky bracelet design that would have favored the watch better. Although this does not favor the watch poorly, and it really does fit well. I'll go into that when we do put it on a wrist check and take a look at the watch on the wrist. But before I did that, I did want to point out one of the other things that I was not thrilled about this watch is, for as sporty as it looks and, you know, echoing the SKX and all of that other history of sporty Seiko dive watches, the crown does not screw down. You can wind it right here. And then obviously, you know, you pull it out to the first, and it's the date in the GMT in one direction and the date in the other. And then when you pull it out completely, both hands move in unison. Now, just a point, when you do work on your watch adjusting or winding, don't do it flat against your wrist because you're putting torque on the stem. Worst case scenario, stick your finger under the watch to lift it up so that there's no pressure on the crown, and then wind it or adjust it while there's no pressure, because you don't want to put sideways pressure on that stem. You could eventually damage it over time. Just a secondary watch tip. As far as a presentation, I really do like it, and the face is very striking, high legibility, big indices, big bold hands. Everything is full of lume. Just a nice presentation. And when you think about this watch is under $500, that is a great value. So let's take a quick look on the wrist. The watch itself is 42.5 millimeters by 13.6, which isn't bad considering that it is basically just a GMT, so they didn't have to add too much to it. It's slightly thicker than a traditional three-handed SKX style or a Seiko 5 watch, and it's 10 atmospheres. They probably could have gone higher if they had a screw down crown, but I guess they were juggling costs and decided to save money there so that they could spend money in other places and have a nice watch at a reasonable price point. So I threw it on the Timegrapher, and it's not very consistent, but then again, this is not set up and dialed in professionally, but it's been swinging between -4 and -6 while I've been measuring it. But that's within reasonable limits when you think about it. It's almost COSC, and -4 is COSC, so not a bad performance out of the box. Speaking of GMTs, I'm wearing wristwatch check. I'm wearing my Glycine. This is not my favorite piece, but it's not a bad piece. And this watch costs around $800. So between $7 and $8, I believe. I have to double check when I do the review on this. But I picked it up primarily for the GMT shootout. It is a Swiss mechanical automatic. It does have an internal city wheel, so it's a GMT with world time functionality in that you can do calculations on the fly. You just turn the upper knob, which rotates the internal bezel so that you can calculate where you are based on, where you want to know the time of based on where you are. So let's take that off. Put this one on. It has a reasonable clasp. Not the highest quality, but then again, like I said, you could tell they're trying to save money in as many places as they can. The watch sits well on my 18 and change centimeter wrist. The lugs curve down nicely, so it sits well. And in general, it really does have a sharp presentation, nice and sporty. When I was thinking about the watch and the presentation, I thought, what would be cool? I wonder what it would look like if it was on, say, for example, a nice NATO, right? So why don't we put it on a NATO and take a look at how that looks, okay? So here's our NATO strap. Through the magic of editing. Now there it is in the NATO strap configuration. What I really like about having it in the NATO is it really does work well on a NATO. It looks good. I think that the metal strap, the Jubilee style is a little pretentious. But on the NATO, or probably a good rubber strap, this should also look awesome. It does look nice on the metal, don't get me wrong. But I think it's sportier and more honest on a NATO. It really does exude the power and confidence of a watch that you could go and pretty much do anything, travel anywhere with, and have the GMT function as well. First let's put it on the wrist real quick, on the NATO. So here we go. Da, da, da. So I'm not going to worry about the tuck now here. I'll do a superficial tuck like that. So on the NATO, of course, anything on a NATO is going to sit slimmer to your wrist because a NATO is thin as heck. But I think it does look really cool and sporty on the NATO on the wrist. I think it's worth the trouble. Now that I have it on the NATO, let's take the opportunity, since we have an unencumbered back, to take a close-up look at that 4R34 movement, which is, based on their venerable R34 movement. 4R, I'm sorry. In other words, the DNA has been around a while, let's put it that way. So it's a good looking movement. And the fact that it is a display back really shows you that they're trying to give the audience what they want. This is a nice sporty watch, but it still has a little bit of a, flair with the display back. It lets you know it's a mechanical, and yet it still is a very sporty piece. And, it's their Hardlex material front and back, so I'm not going to worry about trying to test it as sapphire, because it's not. But it is a durable crystal, and for a $500 watch, it's a great value. It really is, considering the fact that it's a GMT. So, by the way, since we have the bracelet off, I wanted to show you something. It does have solid end links. Nicely done. Feels very crisp. The bracelet itself is actually a very nice bracelet. Nice and supple. Good clasp. and reasonably well made. I mean, it's stamped, but then again, we're talking about a $500 watch. So considering that they did put the effort into making sure it's nice and supple and solid links and solid end links, I think they did a very good job with this bracelet. Like I said, I'm not a big fan of the Jubilee-ish design. I think they could have gotten away with a more sporty, more chunky bracelet pattern, but for the most part, they didn't do too badly with this thing. Not at all. So let's turn the camera around and close out the episode. So that was the Seiko 5 GMT. A really good watch value. There are other cheaper GMTs and there are other more expensive GMTs, but this is really a good package, a good compromise of quality, design, functionality, performance, and style. Well worth having. Thanks for taking the time to watch. Don't forget to subscribe.